Project Lawful aka Planecrash by Arwayne aka Eliezer Yudkowsky and Lintamande. What the Truth Can Destroy. Episode 161.
Carissa's answer checks out, about rational agents with common priors and common knowledge of each other's probabilities having the same probabilities. It's actually pretty clever, instead of coming up with the obvious formalism on infinite epistemic states over infinite propositions. Carissa did this whole finitary thing with partitions of possible worlds, each of which included facts about which partition of worlds the agents inside those worlds thought they were inside, and just arbitrarily declared that not all possible subsets of worlds were possible epistemic states to avoid putting a power set of a set inside itself. There's some rather questionable claims afterwards about how real people should aspire to behave more like that, but they're very Carissa characteristic claims, at least. Asmodea's answer checks out, about the standard central distribution being the maximum entropy infinite distribution with mean 0 and deviation 1. She proved it in a complicated way involving constraint multipliers, but she proved it, and went on to correctly note that adding up lots of different independent variables will tend to preserve the sum of their means and the sum of their variances, while throwing away most other information, such that the sum of lots of independent variables will tend towards the maximum entropy distribution, with the sum of their means and the sum of their variances, aka the central distribution. The rest of Project Lawful wrote up a lot of different versions of the conspiracy, almost all of which are planning to milk Keltham for his knowledge and turn him into a captive if he ever tries to leave, and obviously never pay him his real profits, but which are planning to do that in different ways. In most stories, Carissa is the chief field agent, senior to Asmodea, who is the chief person on site, working to keep everything consistent, both of them ultimately reporting to a widely varying set of Crown officers, none of whom Keltham has ever heard about. In other cases, it's just entirely a set of hidden officials running the whole thing. The Queen is always in on it. The Church of Asmodeus doesn't have nearly the claimed involvement, isn't actually powerful in Cheliax, and none of the purported priests of Asmodeus actually works for him. In some cases, there's no such god as Asmodeus. Other details vary widely. Shalira's version of the conspiracy is not suitable for insufficiently perverted readers. Ione first wrote what he asked for, a hypothetical best guess mostly similar to that of the others, and then wrote 3 other versions. The first about how Golarion mostly borders the Worldwound, thereby explaining away the coincidence of Keltham's arrival there. The second about how Keltham never really left Dathilan, and the third of which is a single sentence: Keltham is still inside the Mirror Takarel. Ione's postscript notes that she's a Nethesian and doesn't want to obey rules all the time.
Trying a variation of Keltham's question with the Shadow Project coming up with theories about an actually false conspiracy inside the conspiracy world, with everyone instructed to independently do their best job at saying what that would be if it existed, showed that. Virtually everyone said the Project Lawful girls were trying to escape Cheliax and evade hell somehow, and that Sevar was the leader of their effort, and that snack service was the key to their escape plan. Other details varied widely and without much structure that Asmodea could see. Basically, obvious things are obvious, and then people make up widely varying details on top of that, so far as Asmodea can tell.
He rapidly skims a random selection of the purchased books. It's much easier when Keltham can touch and control the pages himself. They're not obviously fake books. The fiction, including the erotica, is written in a hugely over-verbose style, and does not really make a lot of sense at all. And Keltham is not sure which aspects are meant to be realistic or unrealistic. It's taken for granted that a bunch of countries exist, including Absalom and Cheliax. Magic in the background works largely the way it's been represented to Keltham, which he did mostly think was the case. He's come into contact with wizard spells and cleric spells very directly. There are beings called witches and warlocks, who get powers in much vaguer ways, and Keltham is not sure if these are supposed to be standard tropes or real things. This paladin acts a lot stupider than that actual paladin that Keltham met, but this could be because the author is stupid and can't write a paladin any smarter than that. This character is a 7th circle wizard at age 14 because he's the reincarnation of Nex. That probably doesn't happen, but Keltham isn't sure. In the erotica section, Keltham has no idea if any masochist or submissive has ever thought this way in reality. But either masochists exist, or they're enough of a standard fictional trope for a poverty-stricken world to have this many different pieces of fiction featuring them. Can Keltham find any hints of masochism in the non-erotic fiction? Wow. Okay, Keltham is in fact glad that Carissa Sevar is not like this. But this character sure is in passing a masochist, yep, in a novel that is apparently somehow not pornography by the standards of that bookseller. Different parts of the books, different aspects of them, feel real versus unreal. The fiction is incredibly badly written, but not in a way that feels like it would be lower effort for the conspiracy to write. Keltham would bet that Carissa Sevar would find it easier to write good fiction than for her to write fiction that is bad in exactly this way. The characters are deeply unreflective. They hardly seem to think about their own thoughts at all, let alone correct them. It's terrifying to consider that maybe this isn't so much bad writing as what the average Galarian person is actually like. Keltham doesn't know which possibility is true. How could he? Various magical facts appear in places where they're important to the plot, and the conspiracy couldn't have just edited that in afterwards. Nothing in it really gives the conspiracy away.
The conspiracy had time to do some emergency editing, using some specialized magic items, while Keltham was continuing his scry trip. There's now several sections of the fiction books that will seem to weirdly make no sense on a careful, actual reading. Asmodia is hoping Keltham does not pick one of those books and carefully read it all the way through over the next several hours. There is not much else she can do, but hope that.
Okay, and now comes the labor-intensive part, which Keltham is frankly not looking forwards to. Personally, he does not actually like tackling epistemological problems rigorously. It's work. Not all of it is fun work either, when you've got to do this much of it. It wouldn't be fun even if what he was trying to destroy with truth was not the seeming of things precious to him. In a case like this, how that looks is not that you pick a prior and then go through everything you've seen and assign ordinary versus conspiracy likelihood ratios. What it looks like is a large research problem.
According to Keltham's teachers on the subject of how to tackle very serious problems, he should first try to collate all the points or observations that are potentially important. Observations or apparent facts that seem confusing even now. Things that stuck out at the time. Everything that caused him to update a lot, because any of that could be an adversarial conspiracy move. Anything interesting that was said early on, before the conspiracy had time to plan a lot. Or they knew what kind of target Keltham represented, or knew what was important to optimize over about him. Then, Keltham should organize that first disorganized list into rough categories, using computer-based outlining software that he does not in fact currently possess. Then Keltham needs to stare at that list, look for intersections and correlations, and write down a lot of possible questions or confusions. Then Keltham is supposed to organize that rough list of confusions and questions, and look for interactions between those. Then Keltham is supposed to try to figure out plausible conspiracies, such that a lot of those questions would be resolved, and make note of the ones that are still unresolved, for each conspiracy theory. He's also supposed to figure out plausible ordinaries that would resolve those questions, if there's more than one notion of what the ordinary world would have to look like. Though in the ordinary world he can just ask. Then he's supposed to pre-update each of those theories into latently detailed background stories that would ideally make all the particular observations have likelihoods with no further dependencies between each other, rather than observations needing to update the particular details of vague conspiracy or ordinary pre-theories, such that later observations would have likelihoods entangled with earlier observations. Of course, this pre-detailing step must further penalize the priors for each added detail. Then he's supposed to sweep through all of his observations for the latently detailed versions of all of his remaining plausible theories. This sweep through all the evidence needs to include an estimate of the cumulative, gradual evidence from all the minor occasions where something conspiracy-ish could have happened but didn't, all the things that aren't confusing but could have been. Because if you only look at the confusions given ordinary as will all tend to weigh against ordinary, that's a methodology that will always conclude in favour of conspiracy. And then Keltham is supposed to throw out the final numbers and go with his brain's intuitive sense, once he's actually forced his brain to weigh all the pieces of evidence.
Yeah, let's be frank here. Keltham is not going to do all that. Or rather, he's definitely not going to do it correctly. Not on his first pass, not when he doesn't even have a computer that lets him rapidly type out all those thoughts and easily reorganize hierarchical outlines. He's going to half-ass it and hope that gives him a more definite answer without doing all that work. Just like Keltham eighth-assed it last night, in his own head, in order to try to figure out which tests to do today, hoping that the experimental or observational results would change his intuitive sense of being stuck inside a fake world, or give him some important further insight before he tried to half-ass this assessment today. If half-assing it does not work, Keltham is frankly not sure he has it in him to whole-ass it.
Just half-ass it, or if that's still too much effort, quarter-ass it, was in fact given as an approved out by his teacher to the supermajority of the kids who were by then staring at the teacher in horror about all that work. That's how it always goes. It's just that only the remaining kids have any chance at solving important problems when they grow up.
Well, step 1. Try to write down all the weird observations he can think of. In baseline, but in a trivial cipher that Keltham can sight-read and sight-write. It probably doesn't help much against scrying, with the conspiracy also reading his mind, but maybe every little bit helps. He made a first pass last night, in his head. He didn't write it out then, in case magic could read codes, and security was peeking at his notes. Mind-reading hadn't been as prominent in his hypotheses then. Turns out, it gets a lot more detailed when he writes it all down. Maybe he should have done that before his trip by scry, even if that would have given the conspiracy much more time to prepare. No, Keltham is sticking with that first decision. If the conspiracy was learning and preparing as fast as it looks, a quick early trip was the correct decision. He can, if necessary, ask for another trip later. Actually, doesn't that further imply that the conspiracy wasn't reading his mind last night, if they weren't alarmed and alerted then? Did he do something that tipped him off this morning, before he even got to Ione, that didn't tip them off last evening? Add it to the list. Actually, the part where he prayed for spells, if they can cheaply read the response from Keltham's god coming back, but mind-reading him is more expensive, would be one obvious theory. Say that mind-reading requires Ilurilatha around here somewhere, hidden, but Mayul, no, Subirax, because she was posted here later and could have special relevant talents, can read it off when Keltham's god grants him alarming-looking spells. His teacher did say to not let yourself be distracted during the observation-collation step. Right, back to that long list of observations. First, items he remembers thinking about last night, but written down this time. Somehow Keltham ended up confined to a very small location and without a lot of outside information. Okay, admittedly Keltham didn't push on this. By the time he had any money he could have spent on a shopping trip, including the cost of teleports and a scry, he was busy storming for spell silver. But still, this had loomed very large in Keltham's notice the last night. The sense of being confined to a tiny world, deprived of observation, it felt like that was the circumstance that made conspiracy continue to feel so possible. Was there some truth of the larger world that they were trying very hard to hide from him, by keeping him inside one fortress? Possibly even along the lines of there existing no such country as Cheliax after all. Similarly, Keltham has somehow mysteriously ended up inside an interdiction zone maintained by Broom's god Otolmens, which explains why Keltham's own god is no longer able to contact him or pick out helpful spells for him. It would be terribly dangerous for Keltham to leave this relatively narrow zone around Ostenso, possible in ordinary, but the critiques of Cheliax that he got from the Lantern Archon and the Paladin felt sort of weak sauce for Galerion. This is something that it took a long time for Keltham to notice, because those would be totally reasonable interfactional critiques in Dathilon. Lawful good, lawful neutral, and lawful evil in Galerion are not actually that lawful, and should be in much sharper states of disagreement than that. Carissa talking about pitting rats against rats, and them fighting to the death in a cannibalistic frenzy, to which she'd sell tickets. That stood out under Owl's wisdom, And even in retrospect, knowing that Galarian has afterlives, there's something darker about it than just a relaxed attitude towards violence. It implies not so much being a spectator, but more like hating the rats. Keltham doesn't know. He couldn't figure out how to investigate this. The Zon Kuthon God War. This is supposedly an incredibly rare event in Ordinary, the last God War having happened 100 years earlier. Even if you say it happened because Keltham showed up, Keltham showing up is itself then necessarily a much rarer sort of event in Ordinary versus Conspiracy, where it could potentially happen every 5 years or whatever, and they haven't told him. The way that Nidal ending up attacking at a moment where Keltham could see it happen, instead of being hidden inside while it happened, supposedly was triggered by Ione's prophecy. But it's never actually been explained how Nidal had eyes on Ione. Ione giving prophecies in a world of shattered prophecy is a further improbability in Ordinary. When he first arrived at the villa, he'd already formed a hypothesis that Carissa might be hiding facts about gods from him. And then lo and behold, there weren't any books detailed in theology in the villa library. This is maybe excused by it being a really awful library with respect to having any broad reference coverage of basics. His future researchers had better books about wizardry in their bags. But it stands out as a successful advanced prediction of a very early conspiracy theory. Supposedly, Ostenso Academy's only book with a list of cleric spells was out, borrowed, and not returned for a few days. At the time, Keltham assigned that 75-0. 30 likelihood for conspiracy over Ordinary, but in later reflection, it seems even less plausible. Cleric spells can be used in synergy with wizard spells. Cleric spells can be built into magic items by wizards working with those clerics. Arcane magics are constructed in imitation of divine magics. Ostenso Academy should have had more than one book with a list of cleric spells. Ione's confession to him. It feels weird, anomalous, even in hindsight, and even with Ione having tried to carefully explain away why she'd done that. It renders it explicable in Ordinary, yes, but it also feels like a latent explanation carefully constructed after the fact. Manohar and Asmodia. Same feeling. There's a story where that happened in Ordinary. It's a possible story. It nonetheless has the feeling of a story constructed after the fact. Carissa trying to mimic outward sexual responses she wasn't really feeling. There's a story after the fact for why it happened. That story holds together. It rhymes with Chelish dignity. But he was still surprised at the time, and it still has that feeling of something that potentially has a different explanation. Pilar going to Elysium. Okay, actually nothing about Pilar has that made-up afterwards feeling. It doesn't make any sense, but it doesn't give off the feeling that any other explanation would make more sense. Still, it's weird and surprising. The Queen of Cheliax, totally decided to go on a sadistic date with his girlfriend. Abigail supposedly insisted on this against the counsel of her advisors. This is not impossible in Ordinary, but it is clearly not what was going on in Conspiracy. If there are tropes producing this kind of impossibility, if that's the real explanation, then it shouldn't have been possible to diffuse the whole thing without any conflict. If there are no tropes, then why was the Queen trying to date Carissa? Today there was a whole book specifically about Abigail Thrune for sale, like somebody was trying really hard to convince him that a person like that existed. And Keltham goes on trying to complete that list, potentially including items from today's trip too, not really trying to organize them as yet. His personal shopper kicked a child. Ione not being present in the library. Keltham is still wobbling between how much he wants to call that a total coincidence versus evidence of conspiracy mind-reading. People do spend some minutes in the bathroom after waking up, right? It just feels like the conspiracy read his mind, panicked, told Ione to be in the bathroom. More generally, there was a feel of the conspiracy being bad at things early on, and then getting better at them later. The Ordinary version of the story is that the first bookseller was bad, the second bookseller was better, and then Keltham allowed his representative to go looking for a real library instead of steering him into random bookstores. And he still basically feels like he is surrounded by a veil that he hasn't been able to pierce. He doesn't feel like he understands Cheliax, or like he understands what the rest of Galarion is like. If you can use a lead helmet or a 1-inch iron helmet to guard against mind reading, or emanation spells in general, is it really the case that nobody mentioned this to Keltham until now? Security isn't wearing helmets. Now that Keltham has seen a bag of holding in use, used to store books in particular, it's much more salient that Ordinary could have offered to, teleport in a room full of books from a major library in Cheliax on subjects of Keltham's choice, and let Keltham have the run of those books for a week. Fine, Keltham didn't ask, and it would have distracted him for a week, during which spell silver work would have slowed down. And yet, his knowledge about afterlives still isn't at a point where Keltham would feel remotely comfortable entrusting his mind state and future to one, even though early judgment apparently gave him a full video view of his own, even though there are outsiders walking around in Golarion, and even though Keltham kept trying to ask. He got an assurance that enhancements were voluntary and for sale, and that seems almost tailored to Keltham, albeit it was the Abaddaren and not the Irorian priest who said it. Maybe people here just don't know how to be specific. And yet. Churches don't like it when you speculate about afterlives. Has that made-up after-the-fact feeling about it? Interesting to contrast that to the business with Serenries. Church disliking pornography for no disclosed reason, which also makes no sense, but in a way that feels more like Golarion craziness than like this was made up afterwards. Maybe it's because it's hard to visualize Mayol or Subirax getting angry about somebody making up wrong facts about hell, instead of carefully explaining things to them. Okay, that feels disorganized, like he should maybe defer it to a full consideration of today's trip, in a more ordered way that involves reviewing the transcript. Maybe instead he should go back to trying to complete his list of the big items that frame the hypotheses that today's fresh-in-memory observations could update against. Keltham arriving in Golarion, instead of being dead, was a pretty large surprise to him at the time. His explanation for this surprise is not necessarily correct. For him to postulate that the Keepers have figured it out as an a priori necessity is not the same as Keltham having really understood that a priori necessity for himself, even if he has a plausible theory about how that could be the case. This is mostly not the sort of thing that Keltham is expecting to explain today, but it's still a big deal that should always be somewhere on any list of major confusions. Similarly, his landing at the World Wound, on Carissa, who seems very romantically compatible with him, is thought in Ordinary to form part of that same weirdness and improbability. That apparent observation could still be better explained by some conspiracy theory. Everything to do with snack service. Supposedly, if Keltham thinks about this too much, snack service is retroactively allowed to help him less. Keltham is skeptical, but he will try computing everything without snack service in it. And if it looks afterwards like snack service is a huge missing piece or an obvious conspiracy tactic, then sorry, but Keltham is going to add in the snack service part. Masochists. Damage-resistant masochists. Okay, they demonstrated that Keltham himself has now acquired the same damage resistance, and there sure does seem to be a reasonable corpus of erotic novels to read on the subject, but it remains incredibly not expected in advance, and goes on the list. The whole Aerolarp thing, with Keltham having an unreasonable number of interesting girlfriends, who were all supposedly quickly collected out of Ostenzo Wizard Academy. Okay, fine, Pilar was supposedly oracle-cursed afterwards, and Marichel, or as Keltham refers to her in private, all other girlfriends, maybe isn't that interesting in an objective sense. But Ione is supposedly Nethys-touched, and Asmodia is Asmodia. That's still a lot of interesting girlfriendness to have been randomly collected out of a Wizard Academy's top female students. Yaisa seems totally unproblematic in any way, except for being way too perfect at what she is and does, while not having any problems. If this whole investigation ends up resurrecting the trope's hypothesis, then there is some kind of huge deal about Yaisa that is being hidden. There have been no hints of this, unless Keltham is really missing something, and it should arguably go down as a point against some more paranoid hypotheses. Galarian continues to seem to be overall worse off than the number of Galarian doom facts that Keltham knows about can account for. Keltham did tell Carissa it was okay not to dump all of the doom facts on him at once. He should at the very least be trying to keep around a possible ordinary hypothesis, where some things are being lightly obscured from him in a friendly way, so that Keltham doesn't, get suddenly hit with something 100x worse than a slave market. No, he should not just put on an artifact headband if there are things around 100x and worse than slave markets. He doesn't think. He still doesn't think. For now. Corva Talandria, who was presumably heavily screened before being offered to the project, publicly burst into tears supposedly in an ordinary way, not indicative of a huge mental break. Keltham doesn't see what this points at, but it surprised him at the time, so it goes on the list. He's been promised a trip to Ostenso in 1 day, which might turn into 2 days. He can supposedly get lots of books if he's a little patient. In conspiracy worlds, this means either that they can fake a lot more things on a day's notice to prep new spells, or that, on a day's notice to prep new spells, they can mind control him. In some way that would have been too expensive or too risky or have downsides, which is why they didn't do it immediately. Keltham was recently surprised, and should have maybe noticed a trace of confusion when Cheliax said they wanted to make a massive nation-scale push at Spellsilver, without having offered him nation-scale resources earlier on, even when it should have been apparent that Keltham was headed there. And why 1 month? That's a weird time interval in which to try to scale, given Cheliax's apparent level of state capacity and how urgent they've been about things previously. Keltham doesn't have any idea of where that's going. He's just noticing a trace of confusion about the whole thing. Seems worth noting that this new deal kicked off Keltham's own attempt at conspiracy review. If the conspiracy is gauging him very exactly, that could itself be some sort of plot. Like Keltham isn't seeing it at all, but he's still noting it down. Feels like some of thoughts, while productive, aren't maximally productive. He should maybe be trying to take more low-hanging fruit. So Keltham tries to remember, think back, notice things that surprised him very early on, when the conspiracy might have been worse at hiding things. If you suppose that they got better at hiding things over time, even today, and then extrapolate that backwards in time, they'd have been very bad at it during the early days. It surprised Keltham, on the evening of Day 0, that Asmodeus was supposedly the only lawful evil god worth mentioning, except for one incredibly awful exception, and that all the other evil gods were totally unworthy trade partners. Are they possibly hiding evil gods who would be decent competition with Asmodeus as trade partners? In the same way that he's not hearing about other evil gods worth dealing with, besides Asmodeus, why is Keltham not hearing anything about other evil countries, besides Cheliax? Back when Keltham's unknown god could select spells for him, it selected, Day 1, Sanctuary, Aura Sight, Invisibility Purge, Spell Immunity, Glimpse of Beyond, and a spell that gave him a vision of horror that was supposedly Zovekan. And Day 2, 2 Auguries, Detect Desires, Detect Anxieties, Protection, Summon Monster 3, Enchantment Foil. Invisibility Purge, and maybe Aura Sight is supposedly explained by Broom. Or the Aura Sight was to tell Keltham his god was lawful neutral, since his host didn't tell him that right away. Sanctuary, Protection, Enchantment, Foil, Summon Monster 3, and Vision are explained if the Zon-Kuthon War was real. Why were those spells there, in the world where the Zon-Kuthon War was fake? The entire spell list should go into the set of things to be potentially explained in different ways. Galt has the only army that doesn't rape and pillage because they're zombies. No, that was GED or Geb or something. If that's true, there should be much harsher criticisms of Cheliax in the books, right? Unless other countries are refraining from that critique because they know their own armies are no better. That seems fairer than he'd expect ranting Galarian authors to be. It's supposedly surprising that he got 4 cleric circles overnight. Carissa said this was incredibly rare and explained it as Keltham's god worrying that he might need to fight. This continues to seem well explained by the Zon Kuthon affair, or just by Keltham being incredibly important, inordinary, but may have a different story and conspiracy. In particular, Keltham now knows that his saves against various spells depend on his caster circles. The wacky wizard teacher boasting about himself, in his book about teaching wizardry, said something about punishing students after class, because they couldn't concentrate if you did that during the day, which doesn't sound like the point was just teaching to intuitive mechanisms, and... Is Keltham, remembering correctly, that the wizard teacher said something about keeping them after school so they couldn't just get healed? Okay, now that Keltham is actually thinking back on that. What? At the time, it was just blurring into everything else being weird and wrong and incomprehensible, but now Keltham has some context, and that doesn't sound like Pilar. Maybe it does sound like Pilar, but it doesn't sound like Carissa, and supposedly not everybody is like that. Maybe this is Keltham misremembering something, and he should ask for another copy of that book, or test conspiracy/ordinary on whether that book happens to be one of the ones destroyed in the attack on the Archduke's villa. Okay, but meanwhile it still goes on the list, in case this is somehow the one piece that causes everything to make sense somehow. He was surprised by the whole Chelish dignity thing, where everybody seems relentlessly cheerful, even if they're actually confused and bewildered. If that's a dead giveaway of anything, the conspiracy might not have realized at the time they needed to hide it. Keltham doesn't see where it goes, but it's a surprise, so it goes on the list. People in the streets in Absalom did not have the Chelish dignity thing going on. People had all sorts of facial expressions.
Okay, yeah. The conspiracy looks kind of fucked at this point. Keltham is hitting like 5% of the problematic points that Asmodia identified in the complete transcripts, that everyone carefully edited in case of Keltham demanding transcripts. But Keltham is hitting some of the largest points. If anything, that's worse. It means Keltham will be thinking about the important points without a lot of distractors. Maybe Keltham can still manage to get everything wrong, if he puts together those pieces without knowing what the correct answer is supposed to be. Maybe. Maybe they can get that miracle. But then, is Keltham going to get his guesses wrong enough that he doesn't? Just conclude that things still don't make enough sense on any known hypothesis, and that he needs to try an owl's wisdom and a fox's cunning to work it out? Does Keltham not demand that Cheliax go teleport to an ordinary Chelish library in the Queen's Dominion today, and grab all the history books that fit into a bag of holding, like he just thought about? Does he end up wrong enough to go to sleep tonight without answers? That's the miracle that Asmodia isn't seeing, and that she doesn't think they can get.
Carissa seconds that. This is just what a loss scenario looks like, with the only remaining possibility being the fake escape plan. Keltham, in fact, picked up that they might have been making mistakes early on. They were making mistakes early on. They lose. They should still try the fake escape plan, modified to be as tropey as possible, because a 5% or 10% chance is much better for Cheliax than nothing. But they should also probably be preparing to invade Osirion. She feels sick, but not in a way that's very impairing. The books in Tien have shown up. She orders them placed beneath the rope trick with a note Keltham can read rather than interrupt him.
Keltham sees it through the screen, out of his peripheral vision. The note is in large letters, but it's hard to read up here, through the screen. Not particularly thinking about what he's doing, Keltham casts prestidigitation, then turns the screen near invisible. A fly, apparently startled by the event, buzzes away. Keltham isn't focused on that part consciously. He's still having a bit of trouble reading the note. So he grabs a lens-shaped volume of air and changes its refractive index until the note enlarges in his vision and becomes visible. Something in the back of his mind notes that Keltham really is become a magic user, now, something that belongs in Golarion and couldn't use all of itself elsewhere. His books and newspapers from Tien have arrived. Good, Keltham guesses. There's a developing sick feeling in him, like maybe he doesn't need them. Is there a point? A conspiracy that could fake the Chelish history section of a library has had time to pick non-problematic books out of a distant place that doesn't think much about Cheliacs, and maybe try to quickly censor or edit those. And yeah, if Keltham is feeling that sick way about things, like things are going to fall apart as soon as he takes the items on his list and starts looking for connections and ways to fit them together, then maybe it's time for him to go ahead and finish this, if his mind already knows where it needs to go. Carissa is sitting on the grass, below him, looking cheerful, as Chelish people do, messing with her headband manufacturing assistive devices. His Carissa. Keltham's not really reasoning it through carefully when he does what he does next. Before that, it might be a giveaway. The conspiracy is reading his mind anyways. That's not certain. The rope trick could defend against it. The conspiracy wouldn't have told him about rope trick if that was a real possibility. Keltham just does it anyways. He writes a note and carefully pushes it out of the rope trick, underneath the edge of his prestidigitated fragile screen. So what does Conspiracy Carissa think of Keltham? Obviously, Conspiracy Carissa's simulation of ordinary Carissa won't really know, or will say something Conspiracy Carissa thinks is useful, though if it's visibly useful to him, it leaks bits. Maybe, if they're reading his mind, and if they're expecting him to figure it out, they're past worried about leaking bits, and will say something else carefully designed to manipulate him. Keltham doesn't know why he's doing that. For whatever it's worth, if they're reading his mind, he intends to compute things without whatever Carissa says. He won't consider it in his evidence for conspiracy or against it, just like if he found somebody with a missing head and needed to figure out without that whether they'd been murdered. Keltham can't really do that. He's not smart enough or wise enough to be a judge in a court of civilization, but he can just read whatever it is, and then put it aside and not think about it while he's adding up the rest of the evidence. She said that to him, that she knows exactly what Conspiracy Carissa thinks of him. Maybe there was a reason Carissa said that. So he'll ask.
Sure. Okay. Her instincts have always been the only thing that's any good for fighting Keltham anyway. Conspiracy Carissa wants you to beat her fair and square so she knows you'll win when we're both trying. And she'll have been hoping all along that when you learn the truth, you'll go to her superiors and say, all right, now if we're going to get started on restitution, here, the first thing I want is Carissa, body and soul, to sell in those markets in Absalom if I like, because she should never have been yours.
That could be ordinary Carissa, guessing at what exactly herself inside the vaguely defined conspiracy could be thinking. Sure. If it means anything else, Keltham will figure it out after he figures out the conspiracy. First, because it sure would be tragic to arrive at a grim conclusion by mistake. Actually, no, that would not be too tragic. Not unless it leads him to do something disastrous. Which, there's things he can do that one would not think would be disastrous, rechecking conclusions under mental enhancement, for example. Anyways, to be balanced, he's supposed to also list out the things that weigh against conspiracy, most prominently among them. Why didn't they just cast suggestion on him? Because people develop resistance with repeated exposure, because it in fact only lasts a few minutes rather than hours, and Lurilatha or whoever would literally run out of spells because people affected by it are stupider about related subjects, in a way that would have affected Keltham's useful spell silver research ability. It's evidence, strong evidence even, but not infinitely strong. It would have just felt like if he'd said any of those things, back then, after Lurilatha's demonstration, that it would have been like he was trapped forever in maybe conspiracy, immune to all evidence, and unable to be happy with the Carissa who apparently loved him. Paranza said that she realized she wasn't happy and wanted to go to hell, a very ordinary thing to happen in ordinary. In conspiracy, there'd have to be some reason to pull Paranza, who isn't in hell at all now. Well, there could be a reason Keltham doesn't know, why conspiracy would do that. But it stands out as something that feels more probable in ordinary than in conspiracy, pointing to something else that has to be true in conspiracy, if the first part is true. Actually, you could say the same about Corva breaking down in tears. That's strange in ordinary, but it's even stranger in conspiracy. If they're just lying to him about everything, why haven't Keltham is having trouble figuring out how to pin down the exact discongruity here. Why not have Lurlatha swear an oath to him that there's no conspiracy? Okay, maybe Lurlatha didn't do that because it would directly stake her credibility against conspiracy's credibility, highlight in his attention that in conspiracy worlds the oaths also aren't real. Cheliax negotiated with him and had some weird asks in the project contract, if they're just planning to steal from him, like the clause about 2/3 of Chelish profits going into a Cheliax-only investment fund that Keltham negotiated down to half. That made him slightly suspicious, and doesn't gain them anything if they're planning to steal everything anyways, so why include that if the conspiracy just lying about everything? Because there had to be some weird, pushy asks, or it would have felt suspicious to Keltham if Cheliax had just given way on all his asks immediately. Carissa did say very early on that Asmodeus's domain includes compacts. Carissa talked about there being a lawful alignment axis very early on, and gods and afterlives falling on those axes. Maybe Keltham can offer to pay Lurlatha 1,000 GP for 10 minutes, during which she either gives true answers to his questions, or says nothing, and then she actually does have to follow through, or refuse the compact. Why wouldn't they just use an illusionary Lurlatha, or is that also not allowed? Keltham can sort of see it being not allowed, on some plausible background assumptions about how lawfulness and lawful gods work. Well, among his options, if he ends up uncertain, are to request a paid truth-else-silence compact with Lurlatha and see if she's mysteriously in hell and can't get back until tomorrow.
Well, we're fucked.
Gorthoclek will of course also be unavailable, nor will they be able to summon whichever devil supposedly bought Carissa's soul. Phrasing it as buying souls is starting to make him more nervous after seeing the slave market in Absalom. You would think people would not phrase it that way, or would find some way to rephrase it more reassuringly, in a world where slavery was also a thing. Maybe hell phrases it that way, because nobody in hell is worried about slavery, and the mortal world follows suit. That slavery market really didn't look like a place that people could escape, just by walking out of Galarian, and into an afterlife where you buy consensual enhancements over thousands of years. He was supposed to be listing out the evidence incongruous with conspiracy, not starting to connect the pieces together until he made sure he had all of them. It no longer feels to Keltham like he'd be defending his world disintegrating by doing that. It feels like he'd just be delaying the destruction by truth, delaying the pain for longer. All right, connect the pieces, as they'd be connected in conspiracy. Obvious statements are obvious. The person he knows as Abigail is not the Queen of Cheliax. The Zon Kuthon War never happened. Asmodeus is the god of compacts. The contracts Keltham signs with Cheliax are binding on them when it purports to be somebody representing Cheliax, and they can't just lie about that to him. Abigail herself never signed any contract except the one stating consequences if Carissa fell in love with her. The rest was all Lurlatha, or one time a supposed representative of Chelish governance. There isn't actually an interdiction. No, Keltham can't quite rule that, so early. Broom has no obvious conspiracy purpose if a Tolmans doesn't exist, and even the conspiracy might hesitate to lie about that. But something is keeping Keltham's god from him. The conspiracy can read his mind, but doesn't do so at all times. They weren't doing it last night when Keltham was first thinking about this. They panicked when they got the information on which spells Keltham prayed for this morning, started reading his mind then, and told Ione to supposedly be in the toilet. Fenalosa kicked a child. Carissa talked about feeding putatively sapient rats to other rats and selling tickets. The slavery market, the wizard teacher hurting his students after class. It points to anti-light, the thing that Zon Kuthon is supposed to be, being present in Absalom, in that wizard teacher whose book talked a bunch about Asmodeus, in the mind of Fenalosa, in the mind of Carissa. If conspiracy, they're probably lying about being unable to identify his god. Can Keltham figure out which god it is? They wouldn't have first said the name after Keltham got clericked, so if this is solvable, it'll be a god that got mentioned as lawful neutral before Keltham got clericed, which Keltham thinks narrows it down to Abadar, maybe Aurori. He doesn't remember if Arakura was mentioned before he got clericed. He thinks after, and then, after Keltham did get clericed, they'd cast whichever god, it actually was in a negative light, because any accurate representation would start Keltham moving in that direction. Well, that makes it obvious that, if it's one of Abadar, maybe Irori, possibly Arakura, from among those three, his god would be Abadar. Banking is the obvious fit for mad investor chaos. It's the thing that could be a misrepresentation of the god of honorable trade. Could also just be that the conspiracy didn't have the bad luck to mention the real god of coordination to him before he got clericked. Cheliak's telling him about a huge push to manufacture spell silver over 1 month. Why tell him that? It makes no sense on conspiracy. If they have to report revenue to him monthly, because that was in the compact, and they expect a lot of revenue in 1 month, they would need an excuse. For what reality? Revenue from a war, using ultimately project-derived weapons? That's really not good, at all. Keltham would be responsible for stopping that, one way or another. But the contract isn't written in a way that implies that Cheliax owes him revenues from stealing other people's stuff using project-derived weapons, is it? Table that one. Keep thinking. The spells his god sent him, in the version of conspiracy where his god is not on the conspiracy's side, and they faked the Zon Kuthon God War. Sanctuary, protection. You are not physically safe where you are. Invisibility. Purge. People are hiding from you. Glimpse of beyond. In other dimensions row behind secret doors. The people around you are not who they seem. Spell. Immunity. Spells are being, or may be cast on you that you wouldn't want cast. You need to figure out what they are. Oracite. Your god is lawful neutral. Maybe. You are lawful neutral. He has only the conspiracy's word that Oracite says anything about his god, or also the conspiracy could have been spoofing that spell. He does not know for sure even that his god is lawful neutral. His god could straight up be Iomedai, though his god's presence back then didn't really feel like something that used to be human at all, let alone ex-feminine. Or he needed to know somebody else's alignment, somebody who wasn't really lawful evil. Detect desires, detect anxieties. The people around you have desires and anxieties unknown to you, and which it is important that you know. Summon Monster 3. Get outside the forbiddance, talk to something that is not one of your hosts, or the obvious other use of the summoned entity. Keltham's mind is by now used to not thinking of this specifically, lest it be mind-read. Enchantment foil. Be wary of mind control being used on you. Could everyone around him actually be chaotic evil? They sure didn't seem lawful by his standards. Doesn't quite seem right, unless Carissa was lying about very basic things very early. And that remains a possibility. And then there's the last spell. Vision of people on fire, burning and being healed, in terrible pain, begging to die. If it's not meant to communicate Zon Kuthon's afterlife, what it's meant to communicate, there's other possibilities, but that could be the afterlife that people around him are heading to. Or some bad future that happens if Keltham works for the conspiracy. But the seared wounds healing to be burned again didn't look like that was mortal Galarian. The message is not that all the afterlives are like that, or at least Keltham doesn't think his god wants him to think so, because there was the early judgment spell, the beautiful city. Did Keltham touch a god from beyond known Galarian? Are all the Galarian afterlives like that? Maybe he can resolve that last question using the overly clever combo that occurred to him last night, after thinking about how different people tapping him with share language sometimes had different connotations for words like good and evil. Tongues plus linguistic analysis. Keltham takes the 5 torn pages out of his shirt from 5 different Phantom Library books in 5 different languages. He may need to flip through the whole books to find words to analyze, but Keltham is also hoping that he can just use the pages to anchor that language in his mind, and tongues will give him the rest. It will not make him as fluent a speaker as share language. Keltham doesn't think. Carissa's baseline did not sound right, did not sound native, when she spoke to him using tongues. As the very first thing Carissa did, before she had any idea at all who Keltham was, before she knew he was not of Galarian. If showing him the capability of tongues was a terrible idea for the conspiracy, good luck hiding it from him then, Conspiracy Carissa. Keltham casts tongues, picks a random torn page, anchors a language in his mind, and goes looking. Within this language he now sort of speaks, for words that sound phonetically similar to, among other potential roots and cognates, Asmodeus, Hell, Zon Kuthon, Devil, Compact, Oath, Cheliax, Lawful, Evil, Lawful Neutral, Abadar, Yomade, Good, Sarenrae.
Sivar, if you want to try the fake escape plan, I think the time is now. If Keltham decides within his mind that he's heading toward Osirian or a Church of Abadar, our options get a lot more constrained. Even statuing him for a week at that point doesn't feel explicitly forbidden by Asmodeus, but it sure would be flirting with the edges of our Lord's commands, meaning we don't. If Keltham explicitly says he's planning to leave the Ostenso region and invokes the contract Lurilatha signed on behalf of Cheliax, we're separately bound by explicit compact with him to not hinder whatever he does in order to book passage out.
Understood. Get a telepathic bond between Manohar and Ione up, and then Ione. Go! She won't be able to feed Ione lines inside the rope trick, but they've rehearsed this. Of course, it's still not going to work.
If you wish to support this AI reading and others like it, please visit patreon.com/AskWhoCastsAI. Any help is appreciated. And thank you to executive producer John Doe 7776059.